developer expert and the founder of a G Suite agency called TechStreams. And really excited to have Laura here with me today. She's going to be talking to us about automation with AppScript. So if you find yourselves doing tedious things with Google Sheets and G Suites, and you know there must be a better way because you're wasting all your time doing that, then Laura today is going to give us some insights and ideas, tips and tricks about how you can automate that tedious side of work using a little bit of AppScript, the coding language behind Google Sheets. So please ask your questions for Laura in the sidebar in the chat there. The SheetsCon team is going to gather them up, and I'll come back in after Laura's presentation to do a Q&A at the end there with Laura. So thanks very much, Laura, for joining us today. Really excited for your presentation. I'm going to drop out now and leave it to you.
Thank you, Ben. This has been such a great conference so far, and I want to really thank Ben Collins for putting this together. It's really a great thing for all people that are interested in Google Sheets as well as now AppScript. So let me switch over here to my slides here. So as Ben said, I am Laura Taylor, and I'm very happy to be with you here at SheetsCon 2020 today, speaking with you on the topic of automation with AppScript. Before we get started, just a little bit about me. I am a G Suite consultant, and I'm very passionate about workflow automation and productivity. I help small business, education, and nonprofits organizations leverage and maximize their G Suite investment. And I primarily do that through developing custom solutions to automate their workflow and drive their productivity. As Ben said, I'm also a Google developer expert for G Suite. You can find me at my website, tech-streams.com, or at any of my TechStreams handles for Twitter, my Medium blog, or GitHub. I have 4 primary goals for this session today. I'd like to give you a brief overview of workflow automation, if any of you are not familiar. I would also like to give a brief overview of AppScript. And then I'd like to step through a workflow example which highlights the power of G Suite workflow automation using AppScript. And then I'd like to leave, hopefully, a few getting started tips for implementing G Suite workflow automation in your organization. So let's begin with workflow automation. So what is workflow? Well, a quick search will surface a number of definitions, such as a sequence of tasks to process a set of data, etc. But really, you can just simplify it and think about workflow as activity to get work done. There are 2 primary workflow components. There are workflow triggers and there are workflow actions. And starting with workflow triggers, these are really just the catalyst or the initiator for your workflows. And they generally primarily fall into one of 3 categories. There are date-based triggers, there are time-based triggers, and there are event-based triggers. And so an example of a date-based trigger would be something, a workflow that needs to happen, say, on the 1st of every month. Time trigger would be something that needs to happen maybe at a particular hour every day. You have work that needs to be accomplished at a particular hour every day. And an event-based trigger can be something as simple as selecting a menu option from a Google Sheet or maybe submitting to a Google form, both of which we'll see in our workflow example today. And then once those triggers are initiated, they perform the actions or the workflow. You can just think of the actions, workflow actions, as the body of work that needs to be performed. So what type of workflow can be automated? Well, in G Suite, just about anything can be automated, but I've laid out a few examples here to get us thinking about workflow in general and automation. So let's say you're an organization who does a lot of new hires, has a lot of new hires. You can certainly automate onboarding process for those new hires. Or maybe you have a Google Sheet which you need to bring in and populate information from an external database or a third-party system, all possible with G Suite workflow automation. Or maybe you're updating a Google Slides presentation every quarter with sales forecast information. Very possible workflow automation. Maybe you're daily interacting with your social media platforms, or even if you're working with clients, maybe you're sending invoices for work performed, etc. All possible examples of workflow automation, and especially G Suite workflow automation. So why do we care about workflow automation? Well, we care about it because it saves us valuable resources. We also care about workflow automation because it saves us valuable time. And because we're saving valuable resources and valuable time, we ultimately care about workflow automation because it saves us money. The nice thing about G Suite workflow automation is that it really levels the playing field for all organizations. Both large and small organizations can take advantage of this power. And I see this all the time working with my small business clients. I am always amazed at the computing power and workflow automation of capabilities that are afforded to them. It's on par with the large organizations. It makes it very powerful. And I also, the nice thing about G Suite automation is that it can facilitate personal productivity. I use it all the time for my personal projects for productivity gains, and I help others do the same. So now let's talk a little bit about AppScript. So I like to think of AppScript kind of as a Swiss Army knife. It has a lot of utilities in its toolkit, and it's very powerful for automating G Suite workflow. So what is AppScript? Well, it's a cloud-based serverless JavaScript runtime to automate and extend and integrate G Suite. And that's quite a lengthy definition there, so let's break that down a little bit. So when we say AppScript is serverless, what do we mean? Are we saying that there are no servers involved? No, in fact, that's not correct. There are servers involved, but AppScript runs on Google servers. This is nice because you don't have to provision or manage any of your own servers. And if any of you have ever had to provision or manage any of your own servers, you know what a savings this is, and you know how important this is. AppScript is also JavaScript. It's JavaScript with built-in access to a number of G Suite services, and it's easy for people to get started because many are already familiar with JavaScript. AppScript is also a runtime. In fact, it's a JavaScript runtime, and a runtime is just simply the engine that parses and executes the script code. And AppScript is now supported by the V8 runtime, which powers the Chrome browser and the Node.js environment. And this affords us some ES6 JavaScript features, which we're going to show a little bit of today. And it's very nice to have an upgraded runtime. There are a number of different types of app scripts that can be developed. You can have standalone app scripts. You can have web applications. You can create app scripts, editor add-ons for Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides, Google Forms. You can create app scripts for the new G Suite add-ons for Gmail, Calendar, Drive. And you can even write app scripts for Hangout chatbots. But since this is SheetsCon, we're going to be highlighting AppScript within Google Sheets. The nice thing about AppScript is that it has built-in access to a number of G Suite services. And so if you are working with your Google Calendar, or you're working with Data Studio, or you're working with Google Forms, or Google Slides, or Google Sheets, all accessible easily within AppScript. And we're going to see an example of how easy it is to get access to these different services, a couple of these services in the workflow example today. AppScript also has access to a number of advanced Google services with a little more configuration. So for example, if you are a G Suite domain administrator and you are provisioning a large number of users, you can automate that workflow with AppScript in the admin SDK. Or I think there's a session later today where you're working with BigQuery. And so if you want to automate workflow with BigQuery, that's possible with AppScript. If you are in the education space and you are doing a lot of work with Google Classroom, you can certainly use AppScript to automate that workflow as well. In addition to all of the advanced Google services, one of the, I think, most powerful features about AppScript is that you can integrate with third-party integrations. So for instance, let's say you're working with Trello or GitHub or Salesforce or Slack, all possible to do with the AppScript to interface with those third-party systems. We are not going to be covering any of these today, but I did want to make you aware of them. So we talked earlier that AppScript has, or I'm sorry, that workflows have triggers and actions. And so I want to talk a little bit more now about the AppScript triggers and how they can be used to trigger workflows within G Suite or within AppScript. So there are two types of triggers. There are simple triggers and there are installable triggers. Simple triggers are just reserved functions built into AppScript, such as the onOpen function, which executes whenever a user opens a Google Doc, a Google Sheet, a Google Slide, or Google Forms. And then AppScript code runs within that onOpen function to perform certain actions. And in our case today, we're going to see how we'll use the onOpen function to create a menu structure inside of a Google Sheet. There are also installable triggers within AppScript. These offer more capabilities than simple triggers, but they must be activated before use, such as the form submit trigger. And we're going to see an example of a form submit trigger, and we'll set that up today in our workflow as well. In addition to the onOpen function and the for the simple trigger and the installable trigger form submit, there are other types of triggers in apps that AppScript can have, and depending on what type of operation you're performing. So there are triggers for editing documents, installing add-ons, selecting menu options, which we'll see in our workflow. And you can even have time-driven clock triggers. And then depending upon the type of trigger that fires, you can have AppScript can perform a number of actions, such as sending email, adding calendar events, updating slides, etc. So AppScript provides several tools in its toolkit, development toolkit, including the first of which is the integrated development environment. And this is how we get our AppScript code into our G Suite environment and start running our applications. And so the integrated development environment is known as an IDE. You can access this by creating new scripts in the AppScript dashboard, which I will talk about on the next slide. Or in our case today, we're going to see a host document as functioning at Google Sheet. So if you're trying to get your AppScript code into a host document, such as a Google Sheet or document, you can go to the Tools menu and then the Script Editor. I mentioned that AppScript has a dashboard. It's available at script.google.com. And from this location, you can create and monitor your app scripts. And then if you need to support team development or version control with Git, AppScript also provides a nice command line tool known as Clasp. One thing to keep in mind when you are developing with AppScript is that AppScript is subject to daily quotas, depending upon the G Suite edition that your organization is using. So you'll definitely want to familiarize yourself with these quotas when you begin with AppScript. And you can find those by going out to the Google developer site for AppScript, and there's a section out there on quotas. So we talked a little bit about workflow automation. We've talked a little bit about AppScript. Now let's step in and see how AppScript can power G Suite workflow automation. I'm going to step through a very simple workflow example today. It's actually a simple approval workflow, because many of us are already familiar with an approval type workflow. I'm going to only cover the AppScript at a very high level. I'm not going to step into each line of code, nor am I going to show you all the code, because again, I do have some code samples in there for all of my fellow developers. But really, if you're just getting started with workflow automation or AppScript, I really want you to focus on the power of AppScript to automate G Suite workflow. Because I am not stepping through all of the code or showing all of the code, I have made all of the code and the install instructions for this workflow available on my GitHub site at github.com/techstreams/TS workflow. So you can find that there and look at the code or install this workflow at your leisure. I've got a QR code there if you're able to capture that, so you have a link. I think Ben is also putting links to this in the sidebar as well. So just a couple of notes before I start through this. I do need to make you aware that this workflow example uses Google My Drive. So if your organization is using shared drives, you would need to make some modifications for this to work with shared drives. Today, I will also be showcasing some JavaScript features that are supported by the AppScript V8 runtime, which I mentioned earlier. But again, if you are not using these JavaScript features, you're just getting started with AppScript, or you're not familiar with some of these, don't worry. I've made a non-V8 version of the code available as well out on that GitHub site. So let's set up this simple workflow example use case here. And let's assume that you are a small business owner using G Suite. You manage your employee purchase requests for your organization, your company, and you want to automate both the request generation portion of this workflow as well as the request approval. So let's look at some of the requirements you might have for the request generation piece. Let's say you've got a Google form and you've got that embedded on one of your internal Google sites where you want your employees to go fill out this purchase request and submit their purchase request through your Google form. And you want all of those form submissions routed to a Google Sheet where you're going to manage all of these requests. Once these requests are coming in through your Google form, once those requests get to the Google Sheet, you want to power your workflow with AppScript to generate those request documents in Google Docs using a company branded Google Doc template that you have. And then once those requests are generated, you want to store those documents in a designated Google Drive folder. Once those requests are generated then in those Google Docs, you want to share those request documents with both the requesting employee as well as their supervisor with view-only access. So they've got some visibility into it and you have an audit trail. And then you want to send out Gmail notifications to everyone for each new request. So visualizing that portion of the workflow might be something like this. Your employees fill out your Google form. Those submissions get routed to your Google Sheet, which AppScript's running inside of that, which is powering your workflow. AppScript then makes a copy of this template that you've got, substitutes all the submission values and other information, shares that document with the employee and the supervisor and you as the owner, and then puts those copies of that request into the appropriate Google Drive folder, and then sends out email both to you as the business owner as well as to the employee and their supervisor. So now let's turn our attention to the request approval process and some of the requirements that we would have there. So all of these requests are funneling in now to your Google Sheet where you'll have the ability to see all of the requests coming in. And then you want to, as the business owner, just be able to go in, make your status approvals inside that Google Sheet, and then automatically have those request approval statuses posted directly back out to the Google document, those generated documents, without you having to go open each one and make those changes. And then once the approval status has been accomplished, you want to send out Gmail notifications then for each new approval status that you make. So visualizing this part of the workflow would look something like this. You as the business owner have just been notified that there are new requests coming in to your Google form, then they've been routed to your Google Sheet. So you go in, you open the Google Sheet, it's still got AppScript running in there to power even this part of the workflow. You make your status approvals in that sheet, and then you use a menu selection to automatically have AppScript post those status approvals back out to the appropriate documents. Then that sends out, again, email to you as the business owner, as well as to the requesting employee and their supervisor. What type of G Suite workflow assets do we need then to set up this workflow? Well, we talked about Google Forms. We need a Google form for the purchase requests. We need a Google Sheet with AppScript running inside of it to power our workflow. For the request management, we need Google Docs for the generated purchase requests, as well as the template that we've got that we're going to make a copy of. We're going to use Google Drive for the generated purchase request folder. So all those Windows overview of that. You need a few fields for the purchase request information. So the first field that we have on there is the requesting employee name. And because we don't have very many employees in our organization, we've just made it a simple drop down so there aren't any typos or it's not difficult for our employees to fill it out. Then we collect the item to be purchased. We collect description, the vendor, the cost, and then the date that the items needed. The second workflow asset is our Google Sheet. And I mentioned earlier that in order to get to the integrated development environment, you go to the Tools menu script editor inside of the menu bar on your Google Sheet. That's where you place the AppScript code to power your workflow. And then in our workflow today, we need 2 tabs full of information to start this workflow. We need some configuration information about the workflow, as well as information about the employees. So looking at the configuration tab, our AppScript code is powering this workflow, needs to understand where some of these workflow assets are. So we've got this tab here in Google Sheet, and our AppScript code during the configuration stage is going to go out, get the workflow assets that are needed. So we need to know where the form is, we need to know where the template document is, and we need to know where the generated request folder is. So we'll see how AppScript sets that up in a moment. The second tab that we need of information that we need for our workflow is the information about our employees. So we've got 4 fields here describing our employees. We've got their name, we've got their email, we've got their phone number, and we have their supervisor. And just a quick note about supervisors. Supervisors are also employees of our company. And so when they fill out a purchase request, there will not be a supervisor information to complete our thing. So we'll just fill in some default data there. The third asset that we need is our purchase request template, which is just simply a Google document that we've got branded for our purchase requests for our organization. And what we're going to do in AppScript code is make a copy of this Google Doc template automatically with AppScript, and then we're going to submit the request information coming in from our form submission, as well as information that we gather about the employee and the supervisor, and then we just fill in those default marker fields that are in this. And we just simply puts a couple of curly braces around each of these marker fields to make it easy for our AppScript code to substitute those values when we process this. We'll have 2 additional tables inside of this request template, one for the purchase request details. So we saw on the previous slide, we have the employee information and their supervisor. Here we have the request details that will substitute when that request comes in. And then we have a third table inside of our Google Sheet for the status approvals that we'll use. And so we'll see how our AppScript will then, when we go through the approval stage, we'll come back in and use this table to update the status. So when we're done with these workflow assets, setting them all up, we would have a workflow folder inside of our Google Drive for this purchase request workflow. And then we'd have our various workflow assets within that. The first is our generated requests folder, where all of these new requests will be placed. Then we'll have a Google form for the purchase requests. We'll have our Google Sheet with the AppScript code running inside of it for our management piece. And then we have our template, our Google Doc template there that we'll make a copy of each time. So we talked earlier about workflows, and they have triggers and actions. We've talked a little bit about AppScript triggers. So I just want to highlight here some of the triggers and actions that we'll see as we step through this workflow today. So the first trigger I mentioned was that simple trigger. It's the onOpen function. And this app script function runs every time you open your Google Sheet, and that code is going to add a Sheets menu that we'll use to configure the workflow as well as our approval process. The second type of trigger that we're going to see is one of those installable triggers. So when we make the association between our Google form and our Google Sheet, we'll set up a form submit trigger that will automatically be run every time a submission comes in from the Google form, and that will generate our request documents as well as email notifications. And then the last type of trigger that we're going to see today is just triggered by a menu selection. So again, when you open the Google Sheet, there will be a menu added, and then the business owner would use this menu selections to trigger additional workflow, both for configuring the workflow as well as doing the approval process and sending out more Gmail notifications. So again, I mentioned I'm not going to step through all of this code in depth, so don't worry if this slide brings a little bit of panic. But I am including some of this, like I said, for my fellow developers. I'm just going to really talk through what it's doing at a very high level, more showing how AppScript powers this. So here we are seeing the onOpen function that triggers every time we open our sheet, and that's going to add a very simple menu structure to the Google Sheet. And here we see that we have the onOpen function, which is adding this purchase request workflow menu that we're going to use. And I mentioned earlier that AppScript, it's very easy to get access to the various G Suite services from AppScript. And so highlighted in green here, we see that we're getting access to the G Suite spreadsheet service, and then we're getting the user interface for that menu. And then we're going to set up the menu and the submenu options. And here we're also associating additional AppScript code that is going to be associated with each menu option, so that when the business owner uses this menu, then that will trigger additional AppScript code to run. So after the onOpen function has run, then we see a purchase request workflow menu appearing in the toolbar of the Google Sheet. And then we see the menu and the submenu options available when that onOpen function is complete. So I mentioned earlier that AppScript is now powered by the V8 runtime, and this affords us some new ES JavaScript features, which I'm going to be highlighting today. Again, don't worry if you're not familiar with this. I did make a non-V8 version of the code available out on my GitHub site, so you can follow along with that if you're not familiar with these. I just wanted to highlight the fact that now we do have some of these features available. So here we're taking advantage of the JavaScript feature for classes, creating workflow objects which respond to each one of these triggers. So the real takeaway here is that we're going to be storing access to the Google Sheet along with the configuration tabs for easy access within our workflow. And once again, we are getting access to the spreadsheet G Suite service in our code. So now we're going to see, now that this menu is set up, we've opened our Google Sheet, we now as the business owner can begin to trigger additional AppScript code by now using this menu to set up our workflow. So we're going to do some configuration steps before our employees are able to submit to the form. So the first of these configuration steps populates, I mentioned earlier, we have a configuration tab inside of our sheet. And so our AppScript code is going to go through and get a hold of all of those workflow assets that it needs to, and then populate this sheet. So the first thing, we're now seeing that we're getting access to a new G Suite service for Google Drive, and we're getting access to the parent folder where all of our workflow assets are. And then using AppScript, we then go through and get each one of those files using the G Suite Drive service, and then we get the URLs or the links to those particular workflow assets, and we populate that config tab. The next thing we do is make an association between our Google form and our Google Sheet. And I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this, that you can do this manually by going out to your Google form, going to the Responses tab, using the menu option to make the association between the Google form and the Google Sheet. And what that does is it brings in or creates a new tab within your Google Sheet for the form responses that are submitted to the Google form. You can do this manually, but we're going to see on the next slide how to do this programmatically with AppScript. So now we're using the built-in G Suite services for the forms, for Google Forms. And so our AppScript gets access to that, opens up that Google form that we're using for form submissions, and then sets the spreadsheet destination. And so not only does it create that new tab automatically, it also brings in the title fields and subjects of fields of the Google form as a header row in that tab, along with a timestamp. So now we're going to again use the menu as a trigger for the second phase of our configuration. So the business owner then goes through, once we have configured or brought in that form submissions tab, now we're going to go do a little bit of configuration on it using the menu structure. So again, selecting that menu option triggers additional AppScript code. And what this does, we want to delineate between the information coming in from our Google form and the columns that we're going to add shortly for the approval process. So in order to distinguish between that information coming in from the form and what we're going to add, we're just doing some simple highlighting here. We want to make the background colors of that row yellow, and we are just bolding the font on those titles, those column titles there. So easily done in AppScript. The next thing AppScript's going to do is insert 4 additional workflow columns that we'll use in our approval process, or the approval part of this workflow. And to distinguish, again, we're setting the background color to green, or AppScript is setting the back color to green, so that we can, and setting those titles that we're going to use for the approval process. So in addition to adding those 4 columns, we want to have a nice data validation drop down for our status. We don't want to have to remember all of our statuses from memory. We just want to have a nice little drop down there. So we use AppScript to add a data validation automatically for our different statuses. And so it's very easy for us to use those when we do our approval process. The next thing we need to do now is use the built-in access to the script service, and we're going to now set up the AppScript code that's going to run each time that we do a form submission to our Google form. So this is called a form submission trigger, and you can set this up manually, but here we're doing it programmatically with AppScript, and we're associating the on-form submit trigger automatically with the AppScript code or function. In our case, it's called workflow generate. So the AppScript function that will be triggered each time someone submits to our form. So now our workflow is all configured, and we're ready for employees to begin submitting to our Google form, and those submissions will come into our Google Sheet. So here we see, now that we've made this association, we've set up our triggers. When someone submits to our Google form, that gets routed to our Google Sheet, which automatically populates a new row inside of our Google Sheet on the Form Responses tab. And this kicks off our workflow generate function, our AppScript code. And we're going to go through and we're going to generate that request document now, and then email notifications using AppScript. So this generate function has several purposes. First, a new purchase request will be generated from each form submission. We make a copy, the AppScript code makes a copy of the template, replaces all those template marker fields we saw earlier, shares the document with the requesting employee as well as their supervisor, and then sends out email notifications. So in order for our generate function to know how to operate correctly, we need information about each submission when it's submitted. And thankfully, there's an object that is passed to our code that has all of the form fields listed in there, as well as the information that the employee submitted. And then it also gives us a nice timestamp so we know when this request has come in, and we will use that as we fill out this or continue with our workflow. So now the requests are coming in. We need our app script code now to go make a copy of that template document, place that copy in the appropriate Google Drive folder, get some information about our employees and their supervisors, and then start filling out those template marker fields that we've got in that copy to generate our requests. So AppScript, the first thing it does in this process is go and make a copy of the purchase request template. And because we have that configuration information on that configuration tab, we know how to go get a hold of the URL for this for purchase request template file. Again, we're seeing that we're accessing the Google Drive G Suite service, and we're going and making a copy. We get a hold of that file, we make a copy of it in AppScript, and then we replace the requesting employee name. We add that to the title of the title of the file. Then AppScript goes, again, we have the configuration information about the purchase request folder. We get that URL for the folder. We again use the Drive service to go get that folder, and then we add that copied file, or AppScript adds that copied file into that generated request folder. The next thing AppScript does, or this workflow does, is go in and get information about our employees. We had stored some, we're storing information or easy access to this information, the employee's information, earlier in our workflow object. And now we use that to get a hold of the employee data using the name of the requesting employee. We iterate through those employees using the name, doing a match on the name. So we find the employee who has made the request. And then because we have that employee, we also have their supervisor. So then we take the supervisor, we name, and we iterate through those employees again to get the information about the supervisor. And then I mentioned earlier, if there is no supervisor, then we'll just have AppScript fill in some default information. The next thing AppScript does is iterate through those objects or those fields that were passed to our generate function. So we're iterating through those, searching through the template marker, replacing those template marker fields, doing a search, replacing those. And then the information that we've just gotten about the requesting employee and their supervisor, along with a submit date that we've calculated that I'm not showing here, those template markers are replaced with that information. And so it would look something like the diagram here on the slide. The next thing that AppScript does is we need to, since this is a new request coming in, we need to have AppScript go and get access to that last table inside of our document, filling in a new status since this is a new request, along with the timestamp. There's been some formatting on that timestamp, which I'm not showing as well, but we've done that in our AppScript code, and we fill in the date then that the request was generated. So now we want AppScript to go share the document that we've just created with our requesting employee and their supervisor. So this AppScript code now goes through. We've got the email addresses of the employee and the supervisor. Using that, we again get access to the Drive service, and we use that to set the appropriate permissions on that file. The next thing AppScript does then is go through and write the information that we've now gotten, or the things that we've generated for this particular request. So we've generated the purchase request document. We have the URL or the link to that. We populate that back into our sheet for that particular request. We set the status to new automatically with AppScript, and then we put in the last update timestamp because we want to know each time that this request has been accessed or modified. And so in this case, it's the same timestamp as the request coming in because we just generated this when it came in. And then the last thing we do in this portion of the workflow is use AppScript to send out Gmail notifications. And so here we're seeing that AppScript gets access to the Gmail service, the G Suite service, and then we send out a new purchase request email to our requesting employee and their supervisor as well to ourselves, so that we know a new request has come in. And we can see there we have the name of the employee that's requesting it along with a link to that generated document. So now we're going to step through the approval process and how AppScript can power this part of the workflow. And so we have all of our requests coming in. The request documents are being generated. The Gmail notifications have been sent out. And we, as the business owner, have received a Gmail notification that there are new requests that we need to go approve. And so now the business owner opens up the Google Sheet, and because of that on open function, we see our menu appear again that we can use. And then the business owner is able to go through and look at all the different approvals that have come in, use that status field in column B to either approve or decline the request, and make any kind of status comments they want to make about that particular request. And then using the selecting the entire row by just clicking on the row number, selecting the entire row, the business owner can then just go up to the menu and trigger some additional workflow for AppScript to do by selecting the Update Request menu option. So when that menu selection is made, again, we're seeing AppScript trigger happening. So the menu selection is being triggered, which is AppScript code is going to go out and make those automatic approval updates in the generated request documents and then email out some additional notifications. So because we had in the previous workflow piece, we'd had that the URL of the request document written to the sheet, our AppScript code can get that information. And then now we're seeing access to the G Suite document service. So AppScript goes and opens up that request document service request document automatically, and then getting the editors and viewers of that document. We're collecting that so that we can send Gmail notifications once all of the AppScript code is completed doing the status updates. So we've seen this code before. And again, now we're just AppScript is just taking the information that was submitted to the request or the approval process or the approval status updates that the business owner made, taking that information, going and getting that last table inside of the generated request document, making the appropriate approval updates, and again with the new timestamp for the time that the business owner made the status updates, along with any comments. The next thing AppScript does then is go back and write a last update timestamp for the time that the update approval status happened, and writing that back to that particular row in the Google Sheet. And then the last thing that we see AppScript doing, again, that we've seen this before, but sending out notifications that there have been approval status updates. So not only is it sending again back to the requesting employee and supervisor, but also to the business owner just for a trail, once again using built-in access to the Gmail service. And so that is just a quick overview. Again, I hope that you were able to focus more on the automation than the power of AppScript. I know I went through a very high-level overview of the code, and so if you are interested, once again, in delving into the code, stepping through it at your leisure, or installing the workflow in your environment, hopefully I've made it fairly straightforward to do that. All of the code and a link to the install instructions for my blog post you can find at github.com/techstreams/TS workflow. If you are interested in more of these types of workflows, powered G Suite workflows powered by AppScript, there are a number of really great examples installable out on the Google developer site at developers.google.com/G Suite/solutions. And there's some fantastic ones out there. I highly encourage you to go look at that if you are interested in that. So we stepped through a high-level workflow overview. We've stepped through an overview of AppScript. We've gone through a very simple approval workflow process. And now I hope to leave you with a few getting started tips for implementing G Suite workflow automation in your organization. So I find all the time when I'm working with my clients that they get very excited about the possibilities afforded to them by G Suite workflow automation. But oftentimes it's kind of overwhelming, and they have a hard time sometimes knowing the best place to get started to get the best value for their efforts. And so I usually counsel them to really look at two main areas that surface some of the best automation candidates for the value. And those include time-consuming tasks within your organization, as well as pain points. If you look into these two areas, you'll usually find some great automation candidates surface very quickly. Once you've kind of looked at those two areas, found some areas that you think might be good areas to automate within your G Suite organization, then I encourage you to dig a little deeper into that. You can identify where your team members then are spending their time within those, especially those time-consuming tasks are usually manual. And so if you delve in and find out where your team members are spending their time, usually you can find some areas then to automate very quickly. I encourage my clients to just simply set up a survey using Google Forms and survey your team members on where they're spending your time, along with the G Suite tools that they're using and their third-party tools that they're using most frequently. Then once you've done that, it's important that you begin to visualize your workflows. It's just like we did when we laid out the requirements for the simple workflow that we just stepped through. You can use a professional workflow tool, but it's just very simple sometimes to step into Google Slides or Google Drawings, just as long as you can visualize your workflow. It just helps to understand when you begin to do workflow automation, just to be able to have a visual of those. And then the next important thing to do when you're laying out your workflows is to document each step within your workflows. It's very hard to automate something that you don't understand or don't understand well. And oftentimes with those time-consuming manual tasks, a lot of times it's tribal knowledge, and so it really does help to lay out those workflows step by step, and you can use Google Docs or Google Keep just to lay those out. So I stepped through a very simple workflow today for G Suite workflow automation possibilities. But sometimes it's nice to have kind of a bigger scope or kind of some brainstorming on some of the other types of things. So if you're not already doing this within your organization, here maybe are some other workflow automation possibilities that you can look at depending on what you're doing in your G Suite organization. So maybe you are an enterprise. Some of the workflow automation possibilities might include looking at document approvals, invoicing, calendaring, mail merge, purchase orders, etc. I find a lot of times with my clients that many of them are using third-party integrations. That's also a great area for workflow automation possibilities. So if you're using accounting systems or finance systems, third-party systems outside of G Suite, or customer relationship management or productivity tools, those are also very good areas for workflow automation. Maybe your organization does a lot of reporting, so maybe you're creating dashboards, metric reports, sales reports, all good areas and possibilities for workflow automation. Or maybe you are a domain administrator, a G Suite domain administrator in an organization that's provisioning a large number of users. That's definitely a workflow automation possibility there, from user provisioning, usage reporting, user management. Great areas for workflow automation. Maybe your organization is doing a lot of resource management, help desk systems, or project tracking, or timekeeping. All good areas for workflow automation possibilities. And last but not least, if you are in the education space and you are using Google Classroom, great area for workflow automation, anywhere from class creation to adding assignments, teachers, students, etc. So just recapping the session today, given hopefully a brief overview of workflow automation and AppScript, and through stepping through a very simple workflow example, hopefully highlighted the power of G Suite workflow automation using AppScript, and then hopefully left you with a few getting started tips for implementing this in your workflow or G Suite workflow automation in your organization. So thank you for attending today. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Ben for questions.
Hi, Laura.
Hey, Ben.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed that. The workflows there that you stepped through. I think it was really helpful actually to see those snippets of code along with the screenshots of what they did or what they were building for us. That was really fantastic. I think a lot of people were benefiting from that. So I think if we've just got a few minutes here, we can just do a few questions.
Okay, great.
So one question that came up quite a bit early on was, have you experienced any issues with any of your scripts moving from Rhino to V8 to this new engine? Has anything tripped you up there? Or
no, I haven't really experienced too much yet. The workflows I've been doing, I haven't really run into any problems with that. I haven't transitioned all of my workflows over yet, so I may encounter some issues, but I have not so far.
Okay, yeah, I think it seems like it's a pretty small. It should really, majority of scripts should move across, no problem. That was the intention with Google. So
yes,
hopefully
that's been my experience.
Yep.
So,
and then another question actually was from someone who is in charge of building the scripts at their organization, and they're really the only person who really knows how to do it and understand it. Do you have any tips for building scripts that will be robust, and maybe any tips around documentation so that if that person was ever to leave the organization or anything, that those scripts wouldn't just break down the next day kind of thing?
Yes, I think that is very important, and I think that's a fantastic question. I do find that it is important to have well-documented workflows.
Yeah.
So just as I mentioned at the end, it's very hard to automate what you don't understand, but it's also very hard to maintain what you don't understand as well. So I think I've done a combination of things with my clients. I've built internal Google sites where I've laid out these workflows, how to use them, and then also a great place. I've even stepped some of the users through the AppScript dashboard. So for teaching them how to monitor in their scripts and really getting people to understand at least if there are errors, what they're looking for, where they're looking for those errors and possible problems with workflows. But really documenting is very, very important. Sharing knowledge with other team members, getting citizen developers within your organization to maybe at least understand the scripts at a level that they could do some troubleshooting and be able to transition there, even if they don't understand the code, just to be able to look at where the problems might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the documentation is so key, and that's both, from the sort of technical side, but then also documenting how it should work. Essentially, what's the expected output from this, so that you know whether it's working and you can keep on top of it. One other thing I'd add to that maybe as well is just to keep the code nice and clean when you're writing it out. Add some comments so that when someone else comes to read it, that they can have that little those breadcrumbs there left.
That's true.
So let's see. Here's a nice question to finish, actually. Laura, how did you learn AppScript in the very first place, and what motivated you to take up AppScript?
Well, I actually have a development background, so I've done this for a number of years in a number of languages. And when I actually was a domain administrator for a educational institution when I started with AppScript. I had come from the corporate world where I had done a lot of developer relations engineering and as well as development. And then when I moved over into the education space and saw the power, I had transitioned the educational space to G Suite. And then when I saw AppScript coming along, I was desperate for automation capabilities.
Yeah,
And so my very first script was automating a help desk to help myself help other people. So I was kind of the just desperate for something to do help desk. So that was actually the first app script. Then when I saw add-ons, I developed an add-on early on. I was part of a developer competition early on, and I just saw the power. And again, I mentioned this earlier in my presentation that it really levels the playing field for all organizations, this workflow automation, because Google makes the same computing power accessible to the small organization as well as the large. So it's easy for people to get started, especially with everything managed on Google servers. It's very easy to get started and not have to worry about the headache of setting up servers, provisioning them, managing them.
Absolutely.
And people can just get started. So
yeah, great. And I love what you said there as well about a great way to start is to automate something for yourself to make your own work easier. So start there before you try and build something for your entire organization. Just find some little thing that's a real pain that you have to do each day that takes 10 or 15 minutes and replace it with a few lines of code. And that's how you start this journey. So thank you again, Laura, for that wonderful presentation. Folks, we've been sharing the links in the chat there for Laura's, where you can find Laura online, and her company is called TechStreams. So we'll share those in the side again and in the resources and the replays when we share them. We have now an hour gap. I'm going to come back at 1 p.m. for a talk with David Crevitt about using BigQuery with Sheets and building data pipelines that can handle data that's a little bit larger than what just a single sheet can do. So that's going to be a really fascinating talk at 1 p.m., so 1 hour from now. And in the meantime, the networking is open, so please go and try that out and meet some other people. And also, a lot of our vendors are live with sessions right now open in their vendor booths in the expo hall. So go and say hi, listen to what they're saying, and quite a few of them will be doing some live product demos. So a great way to learn a little bit about that software and see if it could help you in your job and with what you do. So thanks again, Laura, and everyone else. We'll see you again at 1 p.m.
Okay, thank you, Ben.